Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. Today we're exploring a really compelling legal situation in Japan, the mandatory single surname for married couples. It's a rule that, seems simple on the surface, but as we'll see from some compelling insights, including a recent piece from The Economist, it has surprisingly complex implications.
It really does. It's a fascinating case study in how deeply legal frameworks can impact personal lives, cultural identity, and even a nation's economic efficiency. We're going to try and unpack the core arguments surrounding this contentious rule, maybe challenge some common assumptions about it, and hopefully give you a truly nuanced understanding of its far-reaching impact.
And to grasp just how personal and, challenging this rule can be, you just have to look at the remarkable story of Uchiyama Yukari and Koike Yukio. This couple has actually divorced and remarried 3 times.
3 times? Wow.
Yeah, not because of, marital problems, but purely to navigate this law, specifically to simplify birth registrations for their children within Japan's unique Koseki system, the family register. And then they divorced again afterwards. It's just an extraordinary measure to work around a single rule.
That example alone, it really highlights the significant friction this law creates, doesn't it? Our aim today is to sort of illuminate this ongoing societal debate over surnames, look at what's truly driving the call for change, and then maybe look beyond the immediate headlines to uncover some often overlooked dynamics at play.
Right. The Economist piece mentions this idea of a civil war over the issue. That's pretty striking language.
Yeah.
Can you help us understand what fundamental clash is really at the heart of this surname debate?
Yeah, civil war definitely grabs your attention. At its core, it's a battle between conservative hardliners in the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, they're often called hawks for their staunch traditionalist views, and a growing majority of public opinion. And this majority, it's notably backed by some very influential business groups. For almost 3 decades, literally, opposition bills for optional dual surnames have tried to make headway. And in May 2025, they finally reached the lower house Judiciary Committee.
After 28 years. That sounds like a major political development. So what happened? What was the outcome?
Well, unfortunately, the LDP hawks ultimately quashed them. They just refused to allow a vote.
Wow.
Which, tells us a lot about the deeply entrenched nature of this resistance within parts of the ruling party.
And when we think about who this rule impacts most significantly, it often comes back to women, doesn't it? How does this play into the broader gender equity discussions in Japan?
Precisely. I mean, the current reality is stark. Something like 95% of couples adopt the husband's name. And this isn't just some minor administrative hurdle. It profoundly impacts women's careers, their professional standing. Well, imagine dedicating years to building a professional identity, a reputation, only to have to legally change your name upon marriage. It creates immense administrative pain, frankly, and confusion when you're trying to manage official documents under one name, the one dictated by the Koseki system, and your professional life under another, often a maiden name used as an alias or sushu.
That administrative burden, it sounds immense. How is the business world specifically responding to all this complexity?
They're very vocal about it. Kaidanren, which is Japan's largest and most influential business lobby, they reiterated just in September 2024 that this rule one-sidedly disadvantages women and impedes digital contract workflows. They're urgently calling for rapid statutory change because, from their perspective, it's directly hindering efficiency and, productivity.
Okay, so beyond the gender equity angle and business efficiency, there's another argument that comes up: demographic hopes. Is there a real sense that loosening this rule could genuinely help lift Japan's famously low birth rate?
That's certainly one of the arguments campaigners are making, yes. There's this story of Morihana Eriko, a 29-year-old woman mentioned in the background materials. She actually delayed marriage precisely because she was hesitant about giving up her rare surname. Apparently, it combines the characters for forest and nose.
Forest and nose?
Yeah, only a few hundred people share it, apparently, so it's very personal for her.
That's such a personal connection to the issue. But does an individual choice like that really translate to a national impact on birth rates? Is there evidence for that?
Well, there's an NGO called Asuniwa, which actively campaigns for family law reform. They did conduct a study suggesting it might. Their conclusion was that allowing people to keep their names could prompt some 590,000 cohabiting couples to legally marry.
590,000. That sounds like a lot.
It does. And the thinking is, in Japan, where there's still quite a strong social stigma against births outside marriage, these new marriages could potentially lead to an increase in births. That's the theory anyway.
Interesting. And another angle that's come up is cultural heritage. I've heard this quite dramatic phrase, a Sato apocalypse. Can you explain what that means?
It's a very striking phrase, isn't it? The argument basically posits that keeping separate surnames would help preserve rare family names that are otherwise, destined to vanish over time. The projection, which comes from a specific demographic study by Hiroshi Yoshida, suggests that eventually everyone in Japan could end up sharing the country's most common surname, which is Sato.
Everyone named Sato. By 2531, I think the projection said. It's certainly a vivid image. How seriously are policymakers actually considering such a long-term projection?
Well, it's definitely gained some traction even with some reform-minded politicians. LDP member Kanotaro, for example, has weighed in. He said something like, if politicians claim to be conservative, they should be working to preserve rare and unique Japanese names. Which is, an interesting attempt to reframe the conservative argument in favor of reform.
Okay, so we have all these arguments for change, gender equity, demographic hopes, cultural heritage, business efficiency. What does the public actually think? And if the public is leaning towards change, why are politicians, particularly in the LDP, seemingly so resistant?
Yeah, the public is largely in favor of change. A May 2025 YouGov Asahi poll found 57% of the public overall, and 67% of women favor optional surnames. That's a pretty significant majority. However, among LDP Diet members, the politicians themselves, opposition actually climbs to a staggering 72%.
72% against. There's a huge disconnect between public sentiment and the political stance. What are the hardliners' central arguments against reform then? What are they worried about?
Their opposition is often expressed as fears that optional names would somehow confuse kids and loosen family bonds. There was a Sankei Shimbun poll, that's a right-leaning newspaper, which even reported that 49% of children surveyed said they would not like family members using different surnames. In Miura Mari, a professor at Sophia University, she observes that the more the public calls for change, the more these hardliners are actually galvanized to block it. She even cited a gathering of Nippon Kaigi, which is a powerful ultra-conservative organization where one speaker apparently called the reform efforts a communist plot.
A communist plot? Wow.
Yeah, it really underscores how deeply entrenched and, frankly, emotional this issue has become for some conservative factions.
It's clearly a hot-button issue, but I get the sense there's maybe more to this story than just the women at work angle or even these other headline issues we've discussed. What are some of the deeper drivers or nuances we might be missing when we just read the headlines?
You're right to look beyond that. While the impact on women's careers is absolutely real and significant, the often overlooked deeper driver is probably the profound administrative entanglement. I mean, think about it. Banks, e-signatures, health insurance portals, pretty much every single official transaction you make is tied to your name as it appears on the Koseki, the family register.
So it's really a systemic issue then, not simply a feminist quirk, as maybe some might mistakenly try to frame it.
Oh, far from it. This impacts everyone who changes their name, including men who choose to take their wife's name. For instance, they might actually be forced to quit and then re-enter their employer's pension plan just because their legal name changed.
Seriously? Just for a name change?
Yes. It's a pervasive, bureaucratic nightmare for anyone navigating a name change, regardless of gender. This widespread administrative burden is a massive, tangible friction point. And arguably, it's a stronger catalyst for change than some of the more emotive arguments.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about the argument that surname reform will significantly boost birth rates?
Yeah.
How realistic is that hope, really?
Yeah, it's important to critically examine that assumption. While removing the friction of a name change might encourage some cohabiting couples to marry, that Asuniwa estimate of 590,000 extra marriages. Well, it assumes nearly every cohabiting pair will suddenly rush to wed once the law changes.
Which seems optimistic.
Exactly. It's quite an optimistic scenario. The reality is that Japan's median age at first birth has risen to 31.1. And that's primarily driven by deeper structural issues like job insecurity, the high cost of childcare. These are variables surname law simply can't touch. Demographers, in fact, they expect at most a tiny bump in the total fertility rate, maybe 0.02 points.
So not exactly a silver bullet for the birth rate.
No, it's a minor factor, not a demographic savior by any stretch.
And the Sato apocalypse, this idea that everyone will be named Sato by 205-2041, How robust are projections like that? What might they be overlooking?
Well, that projection from Hiroshi Yoshida, it's certainly a captivating thought experiment. It gets people talking. But other economists are pretty quick to point out that it ignores some crucial factors, things like ongoing immigration, intermarriage between Japanese and non-Japanese people, and even legal name changes that are already permitted in certain exceptional cases. So it's more of a provocative scenario designed to spark discussion, perhaps, than a truly robust demographic forecast.
Right, more nuance there. So if the LDP opposition isn't just about pure ideology, what other practical barriers are really at play here?
There's a significant and often overlooked financial dimension. The IT backbone for the Koseki system, the one that handles all the family registers, it's currently only designed to store one married name line per couple.
Ah, a technical limitation.
Exactly. And the digital agency estimates that the conversion cost, just to update local registries, tax systems, pension systems, passport systems, it could be near $120 billion.
Wow, that's about $800 million US.
Yeah, a huge sum. So you have fiscal hawks in the party balking at that price tag just as much as the cultural conservatives are resisting the ideological shift. It's not just about tradition. It's about the very real, very high cost of upgrading quite old government IT infrastructure.
That's a massive practical barrier. Okay, and what about that fear we mentioned earlier that children would be confused by different surnames in a family? Is there any actual evidence to support that concern?
The idea that it would confuse kids, well, it seems largely hypothetical. We have counter-evidence from, I think, 25 jurisdictions globally that already allow parental choice in surnames, and studies there show no measurable negative impact on child well-being. Plus, Japanese children already navigate quite complex systems in daily life. They manage dual scripts, hiragana, katakana, kanji. They deal with double dates, the Gregorian calendar and the Japanese Reiwa era year. And many are already accustomed to their parents using sushu, those professional or commonly used names that differ from their legal koseki names.
Right, so the idea that a different surname for mom or dad would suddenly create insurmountable confusion.
It seems to lack much grounding in their actual lived reality, yeah.
Okay, it certainly seems like there are several hidden currents beneath the surface of this debate. As we look ahead, what are some of the other, perhaps underweighted dynamics at play here? And what should we really be watching for next?
Well, one major dynamic that maybe doesn't get enough attention is what we could call the litigation clock. There's a new lawsuit filed in Tokyo back in March 2024. It argues that the mandatory single surname rule violates constitutional guarantees of individual dignity. Now, this is hugely significant because the hope is to revisit that 2015 Supreme Court decision, which was actually a split decision, that upheld the law.
So if this new suit reaches the Supreme Court again, could it actually force the Diet's hand? Compel them to act?
Precisely. That's the potential game changer. If it does reach the Supreme Court, say sometime in 2026, a reshuffled bench judges retire and are replaced, could indeed overrule the Diet's inaction. And this creates a really interesting strategic implication. Conservatives might actually prefer legislating narrow opt-out rules first to kind of preempt a wider judicial strikedown.
A pragmatic move to control the scope of the change themselves.
Exactly, to control the narrative and limit how far the change goes.
And what about corporations? Are they finding their own ways to work around the current law? Are we seeing these corporate end runs happening?
Yes, we are seeing some of that. Firms like Mitsubishi UFJ, the big bank, they've actually begun issuing parallel digital IDs internally. These IDs essentially map an employee's maiden name to their official koseki name.
So a practical workaround within the company.
Exactly. And this is interesting because it might be subtly shrinking the practical business opposition. If companies can create effective internal workarounds, it could lessen some of Kaidanran's urgency for national reform. The immediate pressure for government action might decrease a bit.
That's a clever internal solution. What about at the local level? Are there efforts happening there if national reform keeps stalling?
Yes, we're seeing what you could call regional pilots emerge. Cities like Osaka and Fukuoka, they're experimenting with municipal partnership oaths. These basically allow couples, including same-sex couples in some cases, to have both their surnames listed on local resident certificates. These are definitely subnational workarounds, and they hint at how local governments might try to address the issue if national reform continues to be blocked. It shows a clear appetite for change, at least in some urban areas.
Interesting. And finally, what about Japan's international image? Does this surname rule have any impact on that, especially with something big like Expo 2025 coming up in Osaka?
Oh, it absolutely does. Japan currently ranks pretty low, 118th in the World Economic Forum's Gender Equality Index as of 2024. Now, the Kishida cabinet is actively courting foreign investors for Osaka's Expo 2025. They want to project a modern image. But by clinging to what many outside Japan see as an anachronistic one-line surname fix, they risk branding Japan as outdated on the global stage. It's an optics issue that could inadvertently hinder their efforts to project that modern, welcoming image they're aiming for.
Makes sense. So as we look ahead, say through 2026, what are the key indicators we should be watching to gauge how this complex issue might play out?
Okay, there are a few critical points to keep an eye on. First, the outcome of the upper house election in July 2025. If the LDP loses, say, 3 or more seats in key urban prefectures, and if Komeito, their coalition partner, ties its continued support to progress on a surname bill, well, that would signal strong momentum for change. Conversely, if LDP hardliners gain ground, the whole debate could realistically be shelved until maybe 2028.
And the Supreme Court action you mentioned?
Yeah, we need to watch the Supreme Court docket very closely. If the court agrees to hear that Tokyo case by, let's say, the first quarter of 2026, that indicates significant potential for judicially driven reform. If the petition gets dismissed earlier at the appeals level, it probably means the status quo is likely to continue for a while longer.
What about the money side, the practical cost of upgrading that Koseki system?
Right, look for the digital agency budget line. If we see, say, 50 billion earmarked specifically for Koseki system upgrades in the fiscal year 2026 budget, that would be a really clear, concrete sign that reform is gaining serious traction within the government. No dedicated upgrade funds, of course, points to a stalled status quo.
And finally, on the corporate side, those workarounds, the susha aliases.
Keep an eye on corporate practice there. A key indicator would be the percentage of TOPIX 100 companies, that's Japan's top 100 publicly traded firms, that officially allow employees to sign contracts using a sush, their common use name, by 2026. If that number climbs above, say, 70%, it suggests a significant practical shift, a broader acceptance of alternative names in business. If adoption kind of plateaus below 40%, it indicates relatively little movement on that front.
Okay, so as we kind of wrap this up, what's the core insight you really want listeners to take away from this incredibly complex situation?
I think the core insight is pretty clear. This mandatory single surname rule is undeniably becoming a significant drag. It's a drag on Japan's talent market, especially for women. It's a drag on its efforts towards digital governance, and it's increasingly a drag on its global image. And while the initial momentum for reform, like the kind highlighted in the Economist piece, is certainly real, it's crucial to understand that the true, powerful pillars for change might not just be the arguments about birth rate salvation or surname diversity alone.
What are those stronger forces then, in your view?
I think it's the persistent day-to-day economic and administrative friction that the rule now imposes. That constant, pervasive inconvenience and inefficiency for individuals and businesses. That's what's truly building the most significant pressure for change, alongside the constitutional questions.
Right. So Japan faces this critical choice. Will it continue to rely on these creative divorces and workplace aliases, these kinds of ad hoc workarounds to navigate an outdated law? Or will the combined momentum from the courts, maybe from urban moderates within the LDP, or perhaps just the sheer weight of practical necessity finally usher in a proper 21st century family law update? It leaves you wondering, what do you think is ultimately the strongest force pushing for change here? Something to consider.